This is Ira Gorlick, and what follows is a relatively unedited videos that I got from Ken Ham on creationism, where he explains the science behind creationism. It's very interesting, and I'm going to leave it relatively uncut, and then I'll edit it for future videos, but I wanted to put this into the library because I think it's important. So it's about an hour. I apologize for the length, but I think it's important, so take a listen to it, and hopefully it will lead to further discussion. Thank you.
In the previous sessions, we're talking about the fact that all the evidence a creationist or evolutionist, Christian or non-Christian, has is the same. Is that right? We all have the same evidence, the same facts. So the fight's not about facts. The battle's really over how you interpret facts, which depends upon what? The starting point you have, the belief system you have to start with. And so I've been illustrating to you that if you start with the Bible's history, put on your biblical glasses, your way of explaining the evidence, and then you go to the evidence of the present and interpret it, that observational science in biology, geology, chemistry, and so on actually confirms the Bible's history. But observational science does not confirm your interpretation based upon evolutionary ideas or the beliefs that man has concerning the past. And in the last session, we specifically used the example of chemistry, biochemistry, talking about DNA, that observational science actually confirms in the beginning God created, when you use the science of information, talking about chemistry, biochemistry, but does not confirm in the beginning hydrogen. In other words, as a Christian, we had a logical, reasoned defense of our faith, showing that we could confirm the Bible's history. You can't scientifically prove it ultimately, there's that faith aspect, but nonetheless we could use science to confirm the Bible's history. And if the Bible's history is true, we're saying the rest of it is true. Now what we're going to do in this session is use a different example. We're going to go to biology. We're going to use observational science in biology, and we're going to concentrate on dogs and changes in dogs. You often find in public school textbooks, I know when I was a public school teacher, dogs are used as an example to talk about Darwinian evolution, that Darwin saw changes in animals such as dogs, and so he looked at those changes and said, these changes represent the changes that add up to big changes to enable one kind to change into another. In fact, in the British Museum of Natural History, as I'll show you in a moment, dogs are used as one of the examples of evidence that Darwinian evolution has to be true. And so I wanted to discuss that. And the question we're asking here is, do animals change? Because when you look at dogs, you do see that dogs change. But are those changes really representative of changes that add up ultimately to big changes, such as changing dogs into something else? In other words, one kind into a totally different kind. Well, that's what we're going to look at here. Because if you believe in evolution, I mean Darwinian evolution, molecules to man evolution is what I'm talking about, then over millions of years, one kind changes into a totally different kind. Remember from the last session, you get new information added into the genes so that you have characteristics that never previously existed, so you can get something totally different. And this happens supposedly over millions of years. Now, when you read the Bible, it says that God created distinct kinds of animals and plants to reproduce after their own kind. In fact, you find that phrase 10 times in Genesis chapter 1. And what we want to do here is to use observational science to test this particular idea that life evolved over millions of years, molecules to man, one kind into another, or this, that God created distinct kinds to reproduce after their own kind. And again, we need to be reminded of our Bible verse, 1 Peter 3:15, where it says we always need to be prepared to give an answer. So if someone says to you, wait a minute, dogs change, cats change, that's what Darwin saw, this is all evidence of evolution, because that's what they're taught in the public school system through the secular universities and colleges and so on, what's your answer going to be as we look and discuss this dog kind? So let's apply observational science to the dog kind. Now, as you do look at dogs, you find there are lots of different sorts of dogs. there are different species of dogs, all these wild dogs that you see here. And you see there are many differences among those. What does a secular world say about that? Well, it's very interesting. In a secular evolutionist journal in recent times, they made this statement. They said, the origin of the domestic dogs from wolves has been established, suggesting a common origin from a single gene pool for all dog populations. In other words, according to this secular source, all dogs share a common gene pool. If they all share a common gene pool, they're all related, and they're all closely related to each other, which means they're all one kind, which means there's only one kind of dog. Okay, and this is from a secular source. And they're saying domestic dogs originated from wolves. And I suggest to you that the original dog looked more like maybe a wolf, something like that, as you can see there. Now, as you go on in that article, it actually says 2-kilogram teacup poodles, as well as your greyhounds and so on. It says they all come from the same stock. Only subtle differences distinguish dogs from coyotes, jackals, etc. So, therefore, even creatures like that. Hard to imagine that that is related to a wolf. Almost seems impossible, doesn't it? But according to this secular source, all dogs, including poodles and wolves, are all related. Now people often say, wait a minute, how could that be? Look at all these different species here. In fact, some people say, isn't that evolution? And then you have all your domestic varieties of dogs as well, not just poodles, but there are many other sorts. Now, remember, evolution in the molecules to man's sense. You start with no information, no code system. Matter produces a code system. Matter produces information, and over millions of years you get new information added in, and your pools of information keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. What I want to show you is that when you understand real observational science, when we look at genetics, you look at natural selection, adaptation, what you find is you lose the pools of information, if you like. In other words, a pool of information actually decreases over time. It doesn't increase, the opposite of the molecules to man process. In fact, it decreases so much you finally get to the point where there's not that much information left, as you can see represented by the poodle there, which is basically the end of line in dogs, by the way. Because once you get beyond a poodle, well, I call a poodle almost not a dog, because that's sort of the end there when it comes to dogs. But I won't explain it to you. I don't want to pick on poodles too much, but I won't explain it all to you. Now, when I was over in London at the British Museum of Natural History, I mean, it's a beautiful, beautiful building. You go over there to London. If anyone's got the evidence that Darwinian evolution is true, wouldn't you expect it to be the people in London? I mean, that's Darwin's home territory right there. You'd expect the British Museum of Natural History, said to be one of the leading museums in the world. If anyone's got the evidence for Darwinian evolution, they would have so there. And when you go into the museum, you go up onto the second floor, they have an entire section, it's a large section, all devoted to teaching you Darwinian evolution. And as you walk in, of course, the big sign says The Origin of Species. Of course, Darwin's book in 1859, the first part of the title was called The Origin of Species. And then you walk past the bust of Darwin there, and you walk into this big exhibit room. And as they lead you in, they have two signs. And I want to read those signs to you, because what I want to show you is how people in the world today are indoctrinated, how they're brainwashed. What they do here in the British Museum of Natural History is actually done in public school textbooks and secular textbooks throughout the world. They set up a straw man. They try to make Christians look like they don't believe in science, and they set this straw man up, and then they demolish it. And what they're doing as they do this, they actually use the word evolution in two different ways, which most people don't understand and most people don't grasp. And they're really saying, because animals change, evolution is happening, and they use the word evolution for animals like dogs changing. And then they say, because evolution is true, dogs change, therefore evolution, molecules to man, is true. And that's really how students are taught in the secular education system throughout the world. I know in public school textbooks in America, same in Australia, that's basically how they're taught. Students are taught, see, evolution's true, animals change. See, evolution's true, molecules to man. And I want to go through and show you what they do here. If you can understand this, you'll grasp hold of why so many people today think that you have to believe in evolution from a biological perspective. Here's the first sign. The first sign says this: before Charles Darwin, most people believed that God created all living things in exactly the form that we see them today. This is the basis of the doctrine of creation. Stop there for a moment. Do creationists believe that? Do we believe that God created everything exactly as we see it today? No, not at all. For instance, take poodles, right? Poodles are really degenerate mutant mutts, okay? They're full of mistakes, they have all sorts of mutations, they have problems. If any of you have one of those purebred dogs, you'll know that you've got to take them to the vet and give them all sorts of medicines and you spend millions of dollars to keep them alive. I know we have a dog like that. It's not a poodle, may as well be, but anyway. It's a white little fluffy thing. But when God finished creating at the end of the 6th day, he said everything he made was very good. How could he have made a poodle at that stage? Because you can't call a poodle very good, right? It's a degenerate mutant. So you see, in that sense, God didn't make poodles. Now, he made the original dog, but poodles, actually a domestic variety of dog, what do you call a purebred, if you like. We'll discuss that in a little while. And they have actually been formed since that time. See, when you look around the world today, you know, there's one event in history alone that would dictate against God creating everything in the form we see it in the place we see it today. What would that be? The flood of Noah's day. Because if there was a global flood, it would kill off all the land animals, only those that were on Noah's Ark would survive. So how could, you know, God have created all living things exactly in the form that we see them today, where we find them? In fact, Darwin was taught that by the theologians that taught him. He did a theology degree, never did a science degree. And when Darwin heard some of these things, that God created animals and plants just where we see them today, he did some experiments to show that animals migrate and there are differences in animals from mainland to island and things like that. And he was trying to show that this is not true. But see, what they're doing here is setting up a straw man. What they're trying to say is creationists believe God made the animals and plants just as we see them today, but then they're going to go through and show you, but in real science, observational science, we see animals change, therefore creationists are wrong, they don't believe in science, therefore evolution's true. You see what they're doing? They're setting up this straw man deliberately to undermine creationists and to try to bolster the idea of evolution. And so they're saying this is the basis of the doctrine of creation. Incidentally, when God made everything too, it was very good. There wasn't any death in the world. Everything was perfect. There were no mutations. There was no disease or suffering or anything like that. Incidentally, did you know that even in our churches and Sunday schools, many people actually teach children exactly what this sign says? You think about it. How many times in Sunday school literature do you see an example that God created and you try and teach children this example from design, and usually a design feature goes like this. Look how God beautifully created this little creature and designed this little creature to rip the insides out of this one. You see what I mean? God did not design it that way in the first place, because originally it didn't rip the insides out of this one. Originally all the animals were vegetarian, according to Genesis chapter 1, verse 30. And so they weren't violent or anything like that. God didn't even put the fear of man into the animals until after the flood. So here they're setting up this straw man, and then the next sign says this. But Darwin's work supported the view that all living things have developed into the forms we see today by a process of gradual change over very long periods of time. This is what is meant by evolution. Now, do you see what they're doing? Creationists believe God created the animals and plants just as we see them today, but evolutionists, you know, Darwin, believe that animals change, and you go out and you have a look, animals change, therefore evolution's true. Now, here's what they do. After you read these signs, you then go through all these exhibits. I remember there being with my wife once, and we went over there a number of times, and we're walking around the exhibit and said, okay, let's have a look at the exhibit. So the first one was dogs, and they say, see, dogs change. And you look at that and you say, yep, dogs change. I can see that. And then you walk past another one, horses, and you say, look at the differences in horses. Yeah, there are differences in horses, aren't there? Yep, horses change. And then they say, look at these moths. And you look at them and say, yeah, they're a little different, aren't they? Obviously the same kind, but there are changes. And then you look at these rabbits and you say, rabbits change. Yeah, they change into millions of rabbits, don't they? But rabbits do change. And there's some little differences in rabbits. Look at these ducks. There's some differences in those ducks. You say, yes, there are differences in those ducks. And then you come to the daisies and they say, see, all the differences in the daisies. And you look there and say, yeah, look at the little differences. You know, subtle differences, but there are differences there. And then we came to another display. This one was about weasels. This is my favourite display at the British Museum of Natural History, because when I came to the weasels, the sign they had on the weasels caused me to levitate 3 feet off the ground. I mean, really, it was phenomenal. It's an experience that I wanted to share with you. You're going to levitate 3 feet off the ground when you read this as well. I mean, it is phenomenal. You really read this. It was almost like a religious experience, a spiritual experience, just reading this sign. You watch. When weasels breed together, they produce more weasels like themselves. I mean, did that grip your heart like it gripped mine? I mean, it really read that, and then you look at the sign and the picture, and it says, You know, here are the weasels, and they produce more weasels and say, wow, that's true, that does happen. Well, anyway, we left the weasels, and then when you get to the end of all these displays, I want you to have a look what they wrote. In this exhibition, we have tried to show how Darwin's theory of natural selection can explain how living things evolved. Whoa, do you see what they did? They started at the beginning. Creationists believe God created everything just as we see today. Evolutionists believe animals change and plants change. Now let me show you. See, horses change, dogs change, cats change, etc. They all change. And now, therefore, living things evolved. Do you see what they've done? So they're setting up this straw man. They're teaching you incorrectly about what creationists believe. And then they use the word evolution to apply to changes in dogs, changes in rabbits, changes in horses and so on. And then at the end, they use the word evolution to say living things evolve, meaning molecules to man. And you know what, students? That's exactly how students in the public schools, secular colleges are indoctrinated, and they don't realize what's happening to them. Now, I know when we got to that sign there, my wife said, well, wait a minute. I didn't see evolution. Can we go around again? We must have missed something. I said, sure, let's go around again. So we went around again. So first of all, we looked at the dogs, right? And as we looked at the dogs, we said, you know what? That's right. There are changes in dogs. Yes, that's true. And then we looked at the horses. Said, yep, yeah, there's a change in the horses. And then we looked at the moths, changes in moths. And then we looked at the rabbits, yeah, changes in rabbits there. And then we looked at the ducks, yes, changes in ducks. And we looked at the daisies, and we came to the weasels again. And we stood and we contemplated. Weasels produce weasels. Wow. And then we read the sign again. Here it is. Darwin's theory of natural selection explains how living things evolved. Whoa, wait a minute. What did we see? We saw dogs, we saw horses, we saw moths, we saw rabbits, we saw ducks. What do you mean, evolution? See, they're implying molecules to man evolution is true because changes in animals, which they call evolution, is true. Now, let me show you what really is going on here. Now, I don't know how many dogs there were at the beginning. When God created, if all dogs are one kind, let's assume he created 2 dogs. There are probably more than 2 dogs that he created, but let's say 2 dogs. Okay, they got married, had kids, and we end up with some dogs. More dogs. They got married, had kids, we end up with more dogs. They got married and have kids, we get more dogs again. They got married and have kids, and it goes on and on and on, and we end up with lots of dogs. Okay, so now we have lots of dogs. Okay, people say, but that doesn't explain how you get dingoes and coyotes and wolves and jackals and so on. Well, you know, in genetics, we use a convention to talk about genes. We label them according to the letters of the alphabet, like big A, big B, little b, big C, little c. That's how we label these genes. Now, you know, we talk about dominant genes being capital letters, recessive genes being the small letters. It is much more complicated than this. That's what I want you to understand. Much more complicated. But nonetheless, the basic principles, in looking at this way, the basic principles are the same, even though it's much more complicated. So if you have a male and female here, you can see this is a male dog, and here we have a female dog, and you've got these pairs of genes, big A, big B, little b, and so on. Then you get one set of genes from the male, one from the female. You know, sperm fertilizes egg, and you get an individual. And of course, you know, in the sperm and the egg, you have half the number of chromosomes as a result of meiosis. And so now we end up with all these different combinations here as a result of these 2 up here. Now I want you to look up here. Here are the 2 parent dogs. Now here we have all the offspring. But have a look at these offspring. They're all a little different combination to each other, but they all inherited that information from the original pair here. So if these are dogs, what are these down here? Dogs. They're dogs, exactly. Now notice something. This one here has all big A's, big B's, big C's. It doesn't have the little A's, little B's, little C's, which means it's lost information. It doesn't have the little a, little b, little c information, but it still has the information to be a dog, but it's actually lost some variability because it's lost the variability in the little a, little b, little c. Now, I want you to think about this. How much variability do you think God put into the original gene pool? Well, I'm going to explain it this way. If you took 1 man and 1 woman from this audience, how many children do you think you could have? You get married, have kids. How big a family could you have without having 2 with the same combination? Million? Billion? Wonder how many possible combinations you could have. All right, well, let me tell you. You might be surprised at this. Does anyone know how many atoms there are in the universe? Does anyone ever count them? Actually, scientists have estimated the number of atoms in the whole universe. It's about 10 to the 80th power. That's a 1 followed by 80 zeros. That number's so big you can't even think about it. You know what an electron is? You've heard of electrons, haven't you? Okay. If you packed electrons into the whole space of the universe, how many electrons do you think would fit into the space of the known universe? Scientists have estimated that. 10 to the 130th power. That's a 1 followed by 130 zeros. Now that number is even bigger, and I mean you can't even think that high. If you took one man and one woman from your genes, from your information storage system, your DNA, how much variability do you have that God inbuilt there to produce offspring? How many possible combinations could you have? Did you know an evolutionist has actually worked that out, and it comes to 10 to the 2017th possible combinations. I mean, that number is so large. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. By the way, there's a family if you want to aim for a family, okay? That really is a family right there. Now, I wanted you to understand that God put that same sort of variability in dogs, in cats, in elephants, as well as humans. So incredible variability in that DNA storage system. In fact, DNA is such a phenomenal storage system. There are scientists today that are looking at DNA to see if they can in some way use it to take computers to a whole nother level, a higher level of technology, because we sort of seem to be at the end of the limits of what man can do. So now we're looking at what God can do, which is so much greater than what man can do. Now, think in terms of biblical history, okay? You've got all this variability in our genes, and think of the event of Noah's Ark at the time of Noah's flood. God sent to Noah 2 of every kind of land animal, 7 of some, but 2 of every. 7 of the clean, right, but 2 of all the unclean. There's 2 of every kind. Now, dogs obviously would be classed as unclean. If all dogs are related, there's only one kind of dog. Therefore, how many dogs would have been on Noah's Ark? 2, exactly, 2 dogs. So we have 2 dogs on Noah's Ark, okay? They get off Noah's Ark, get married, have kids, and we end up with lots of dogs again. Only this time, what's going to happen? As the population builds up, do you realize they're not going to stay together, are they? They're not going to stay together in one place. And that really brings us to the point of what our next session is going to do as we talk about this in our final session that I'm doing in regard to using observational science to confirm the Bible's history. Now, others will do other subjects in this series, such as geology and talk about astronomy to show you how observational science confirms the Bible's history. But as we move into the final session here, I want you to be thinking like this. I want you to be thinking in terms of this. If you go back to look at those possible combinations I had from big A, big B, little b, big C, little c, you imagine the amount of variability in the original dog kind that probably was represented as what was on Noah's Ark. God selected the dogs to go on Noah's Ark. Imagine the zillions of possible combinations of genes. As those dogs build up in population on the earth, are they going to stay together as one group? No, they're not going to stay together. Some are going to go north, south, east, west, aren't they? What do you think will happen as they go north, south, east, west? Are the same genes going to end up in each group?
No.
No, they're not. So do you start to get an inkling of what sort of can happen here? Different combinations of genes end up going in different directions, and different combinations end up surviving better in some areas than other areas. And actually that provides a basis for explaining why we get these different species and varieties of dogs through what's called adaptation and natural selection. Now, I'm going to explain that in more detail in the next session to you, but I want you to understand that Christians can believe in natural selection. Christians can believe in adaptation. Not only can believe, we must believe, because that's observational science. I was at a conference just recently, and a young student came up to me and he said, look, I don't believe in evolution in the sense of molecules to man, but he said, I've been taught evolution at school and I've seen evolution work. And he said, I have to believe in some form of evolution, don't I? And I said, now, let me suggest to you what you're really talking about here. Are you talking about natural selection and speciation and changes you see within a kind like dogs? And he said, yes. I said, you were taught that's evolution, right? And he said, yes. I said, but that's not the same as molecules to man. And that's when he said, explain that to me. And so I went through and started explaining like this using genes and talking about the fact that, you know, with the creation model here, based upon Scripture, you start with the original kinds of animals and plants. You start with the original pools of information that God created. And then, over a period of time, as animals mix together and so on, then split apart, that pool gets diluted, and you might even lose information over time as animals die out and maybe lose genes. from an evolutionary perspective, you start with no information and you increase the amount of information, get increasing pools of information. And I said, you've got to understand something. Molecules to man evolution means you get brand new information that never previously existed that gets added in to the genes. Whereas when you start from the Bible, you start with all the information that God put there and you separate it out and you might lose some. It's the opposite of that evolutionary process. We have never seen a mechanism that produces information from matter. We've never seen matter produce a code. Remember that from one of the previous sessions that we did? And so what you're looking at in natural selection, here's the question to ask. Is it the addition of brand new information that never previously existed? The answer is no. It's the sorting out of the pool that's already there. And when you understand that, you realize when people use the word evolution for the changes within dogs, that has nothing to do with what's called Darwinian evolution, which means molecules to man. In fact, it's the opposite of molecules to man, because you're losing information, separating out information, you're not gaining information. So when you correctly understand natural selection, as we'll look into in more detail in the next session, as you correctly understand natural selection, you'll realize that we're looking at observational science that confirms the Bible statement, God made distinct kinds of animals and plants to reproduce after their own kind, but is also observational science that actually goes against, dictates against the idea that one kind changes into another. In other words, the Bible's true. And again, without faith, it's impossible, but it's not a blind faith. We have a logical, reasoned defense of our faith. So let's leave it there for this session and get ready for the next session where we'll talk in natural selection in more detail and be thinking in your own mind, okay, after the flood we have this group of animals, group of dogs, and now they're not going to stay together, so what's going to happen? And that provides a basis for us for now launching into really understanding natural selection and its mechanism, and to see it actually confirms the Bible's history. Now in the last session we were applying observational science in biology, particularly using dogs, to show that those changes that we see in dogs, and I said they weren't uphill changes, they're really downhill changes, and we're going to really look at that in detail here. Those changes, some people call evolution, but then they use the same word evolution for molecules to man. Now when most people think of the word evolution, they're really thinking molecules to man. But at the same time, students in the secular education system usually taught that evolution is the term you use when you're talking about changes in animals, then evolution is the term you use when you're talking about molecules to man. So we need to explain those things as we did in the last session. So the changes that we see in dogs is not evolution in the molecules to man sense, it's just changes within the gene pool of dogs. And it actually goes against the idea of molecules to man evolution. Now, we ended up by talking about the fact that all dogs were one kind. Even the secular scientists agree with that, because all dogs are related. And that two dogs came off Noah's Ark and they had offspring, and you'd build up the population of dogs again after the flood, and we'll end up with this large population of dogs, but they're not going to all stay together. They're not going to all stay together. The gene pool will eventually split up as dogs move off in different directions. And of course we believe that at the end of the flood, for a few hundred years associated with the flood, as a result of the flood, there was an ice age that lowered ocean levels, and so would enable dogs and other creatures as well to migrate over land bridges all over the earth, and then as the ice age ends, basically the ice melts and then the land bridges disappear and so on. So this all plays into all of that as well, but we're not dealing with that in detail in this session. Now, what happens as that population of dogs splits up? You get different combinations of genes that move in different directions. Now let me give you an example to help us understand what happens here in this process of natural selection adaptation. We're going to talk about the two dogs that were on Noah's Ark. So have a look at these two dogs, great looking dogs. I'm sure everyone would want a dog like this, wouldn't they? Of course, how do we know the dogs on Noah's Ark look like that? We don't know, because that's in the past and that's a limitation of observable science. See, we're applying all this. But anyway, here we have two dogs, and in dogs you can have genes for long hair and short hair. This gene here is for short hair, this gene here is for long hair. See all the long hair coming off the gene? Now that's just a pictorial representation of this to help us understand it, okay? In genetics, sometimes, instead of being dominant recessive, as I said, it's always much more complicated than what I give you here. I'm just giving you the big picture. But in genetics, we can have instances where one gene will interact with another gene. So when long hair gene and short hair gene interact together, instead of one being dominant, one recessive, they actually produce a medium effect. And so the median effect here is that you have basically medium hair-length dogs. Now, imagine this. You get two dogs getting off Noah's Ark, and they have a gene for short hair and long hair each. And then they have offspring that inherit the short-haired gene from the male, short-haired gene from the female, and this one gets two short-haired genes, which means it's going to be short-haired as a dog, correct? Okay. Then we know that you could get those that get a gene for short hair and a gene for long hair from each, and in fact there's two possible combinations here, but they each have a short-haired gene and a long-haired gene, which means they're going to be in the middle, just like the ones on Noah's Ark. And then the dog that inherits both genes for long hair is going to be a long-haired dog. You understand that? Okay. Now, imagine that with all these dogs here, those that have any gene for short hair at all die out of the population for some reason. They're all gone. And you're only left with dogs that have genes for long hair. Now, if dogs with genes for long hair mate with another dog with genes for long hair, you're only going to get offspring that all have what? Long hair. And on their own, could they ever produce dogs with short hair again? Or medium hair length again? No, they couldn't, because you've lost the information for short hair. You see that? Now, apply that through the process of natural selection. Here we have dogs that move towards a cold climate. Those that have the right combination of genes for long hair survive better than those for short hair. Those for short hair might die out before they're old enough to reproduce or something like that, and they get eliminated from the particular population. And so over time, you'll end up with a species of long-haired dog, okay? The opposite in a hot climate, where those with long hair maybe die of overheating or something or other, whatever, but over time you get a species of short-haired dog through all sorts of other environmental factors, the process of what we call natural selection, adaptation. There are genetic factors as well. It all gets very, very complicated, but over a period of time you sort out the genes in the dog population, and so you can end up with all these different species of dogs and different varieties of dogs, but they're still 100% dogs. And even though some of them might not even interbreed anymore because they become so isolated from each other, and some of them, because they've lost certain information, can't interbreed. There's all sorts of reasons why they can't, and they can even be classed as different species, but they all go back to the original dog stock, so they're still all the same dog kind, aren't they? That's not evolution in the molecules to man sense. It's the opposite, because you start with a big pool of information and you sorted out that information and even lost information. Now, as you look at that, again, what I'm saying to you is this. You imagine you start with this male and female here, and if you end up with dogs with, say, all big A's, big B's, big C's, say all the rest died out of the population, well, you've lost your little A's, little B's, little C's. You see that? So you've lost information. Now, not only your wild dogs, but also your domestic dogs, which are all related to the dog kind, and even the secular scientists said they all come originally from wolves. So even when you see creatures like this, which I must admit doesn't even look like a dog, but I guess it is a dog, or you see poodles, okay, or you see all these domestic varieties of dogs that we have here, people say, okay, well, how did they come about? Well, what happened here is what we call artificial selection. In other words, we get involved, man gets involved, and we determine which one breeds with which. Now, normally, domestic varieties would not form out there in the wild, and the reason is because most of them are full of mutations. Sorry about that, but they really are. For instance, my wife has a little dog, just to show you that I'm not a dog hater and I don't hate little fluffy purebred dogs. There I am holding our little dog. And her name is Minty. Doesn't she look cute? She is one of the cutest degenerate mutants you'll ever find. I mean, she's really full of all sorts of mutations. She has a mutation that causes her hair to grow. See, we like that in dogs, when their hair keeps growing, but we have to get them groomed all the time. It costs us money, doesn't it? This little dog here has certain problems. It has, well, when the weather changes, it throws up. In fact, it throws up just before the weather changes. So often we're at home sitting there, the dog throws up, we say, it's going to rain. So we have a great barometer right there in our house. We also find with our little dog, it has other problems. If you take it outside and you don't show it its way back to the door, it loses its way. It had bladder stones and had to have an operation. That cost about $1.2 million to get the dog fixed up. Once we got it home, it sprung a leak. And so then we had to take it back to the vet, and the vet put it on estrogen. which is interesting because people say, how's your dog? My dog's on estrogen. How's your dog? You know, I mean, it's very embarrassing. And we have to spend millions of dollars keeping this thing alive. You know what really gets me? The mongrel dog down the street that's a mixture of everything in the neighborhood, right, can lick the slime out of the gut. He can run over them in a truck and they get up and wave and off they go. Now, what I want to show you is the difference here. You see, have a look at this diagram again. See, the original dog, more like the wolf here, is a mixture. You know, these original male and female here, a mixture of big A's, big B's, little B's, big C's, little C's. That represents the original dog, so to speak. But what we call our purebreds, what we try to do is we say, oh, here's one that has a short nose, here's one that has a short nose, and let's try to get all the genes for short nose together to get the shortest nose we can. But at the same time, our domestic varieties have mutations, like our dog, mutation that causes its hair to grow. Some have mutations that give it short legs and so on. They wouldn't survive out there in the environment normally, but what we do is we take them to the vets and we make sure they survive. And those mutations exist because of sin. But that's why your domestic varieties don't occur out there naturally, so to speak. We have to do it artificially. Now, as well as that, what we're trying to do in a purebred dog is get rid of all the variability that's there and try to get them to be what we call a particular breed. And so we really try to get them to this stage, little a, little b, little c, in a sense, analogous to that. Think about this for a moment. If you had a, little b, little c, breed with another one exactly the same, in other words, if poodle breeds with poodle, you're only going to get what? A poodle. Sad, but true, okay? Whereas, if you start with these two up here, male and female, you're going to get all sorts of combinations, aren't you? But if you start with just the little a's, little b's, and little c's, there's no more combinations because you've really reduced the variability. There's no variability there. So think about this. If you started with wolves all over again, theoretically, in a sense, could you eventually, again, get poodles? And the answer is yes. But if you started with poodles and all you had were poodles, could you eventually go back to wolves? The answer is no, unless you mix them together with all the others to get back all those genes again. So, by the way, you apply that to the humankind as well, and that's a whole other area that we're not going to deal with in this session. It's the area of so-called races. If the Bible's right, we're all descendants of one man and one woman, right? Think about that. Now, why do we have different people groups? At the Tower of Babel, God gives different languages. What happens? You split up the human gene pool, just like with dogs, different combinations end up in different directions, and then what happens? Some survive better than others, and you end up with distinguishing characteristics of those different people groups. And one example I often use is skin color, because actually everyone has the same skin color. There are really no white people, there are really no black people. We have a pigment called melanin. And your big A, big B in genes in humans, talking about skin color, if you have all big A's, big B's, big C's, for the pigment called melanin, you could have a lot of melanin and be very dark. If you have all little A's, little B's, little C's in humans for skin color, for the pigment melanin, that's what it's called, then you'd have a little bit of melanin, you'd be very light. And actually, if you're in the middle with the big A, big B, little B, big C, little c, you'd be middle brown, which the majority of the world's population are. So you can understand that at the time of the Tower of Babel, because God gave different languages, some people would end up with a mixture of the genes, be middle brown. Some would end up with all big A's, big B's, big C's, and be dark. And some would end up with little A's, little B's, little C's, and so on. I was on a radio program once, and a man called up and he said, I'll believe that black people and white people are all descendants of Adam when you can show me 2 white people having a black baby and 2 black people having a white baby. Now, when anyone asks you that sort of thing, you should be able to come back to them and say, well, wait a minute, are 2 poodles going to have a wolf? You get the idea? Because once you've sorted out the genes and you've lost that variability, if you've got all genes for dark skin, you're not going to be able to, if you marry someone with the same sort of genes like that, with say all big A's, big B's, you'll never produce someone with light skin on their own. You'd have to marry someone who had some of the little A's and little B's to get that variability back. So you see, these things apply in lots of different areas. And once you understand some of this basic genetics from dogs, you can apply it in humans and understand all sorts of interesting things here. Now, over a period of time then, what I'm saying to you is, when we use the dog kind, we start with a big pool of information and all this variability. Over time, we lose variability. The pool gets smaller. You still got the pool to be a dog, and you get down to the stage where there's not that much information left. So in other words, what I'm saying is the original dog looked more like that. The original dog could not have looked like that, okay? That's a very specialized dog. From those dogs there, you could never get back to that. But from 2 of these dogs, you could eventually get that. And so to put it more succinctly and summarize it for you, we start with a jar of jelly beans representing all the original variability in dogs, okay? Not the number of genes, but the original variability in our genes. Over a period of time, you can end up with less and less information. The pool of information decreases. You can even get to the stage where there's not that much information left, and you end up with a one jelly bean dog, right? And of course, I don't like cats either, as you can see there. Now, in the public schools, what you'll find is students are taught, but it's not just natural selection. See, what we observe there in looking at dogs changing, the process of natural selection or adaptation, and as a Christian, as a creationist, of course, we believe in those things because we observe them happening, but it's only, what we're looking at there are processes that operate on the information that was already there. That's the opposite of evolution in the molecules to man sense, which requires new information that wasn't there that gets added into the system. So you see, as you look at that, you say, how can anyone believe in molecules to man evolution? Hey, if they understand real observable science, they can't. If they really understood it, it's impossible, which means they have to believe it by blind faith. And they say, oh, but I think there is a mechanism there somewhere, but it's blind faith. Now, in the secular education system, what they're taught is not just natural selection, but it's natural selection plus mutation. You've all heard of mutations, haven't you? What about mutations? Can they add in the new genetic information that molecules to man evolution would require? The answer is no. Here is a quote from a man who is not a Christian, he's not a creationist, who's a fellow at Johns Hopkins University. He wrote a book called Not by Chance, Dr. Lee Spector, and he said this: all point mutations, when you understand them at the molecular level, they turn out to, what's that next word? Reduce the genetic information and not to increase it. Now, let me tell you again how students in secular colleges, secular education systems, through the media, are indoctrinated and brainwashed into believing that molecules to man evolution is true. One of the examples they're given to substantiate in their minds that evolution is happening in a molecules to man sense is that bacteria can gain a resistance to antibiotics. And that's one of the examples that's given. You all heard of that particular example? We can have bacteria that gain a resistance to antibiotics, or viruses become resistant to certain drugs like the AIDS virus or something like that. And so they're given those examples, and it sounds like molecules to man evolution. It's one of the examples that's used in a lot of public school textbooks, and you often read it in the newspapers when people write in against a creationist and say, but we can see evolution happening. Look at bacteria that evolve to gain a resistance to antibiotics. I want to give you just one example to show you when you do understand real, observable, testable science, and you understand what's going on at the molecular level, it has nothing to do with a gain of information. Can bacteria who don't have a resistance to antibiotics actually gain a resistance to antibiotics? And the answer is yes. Sounds like evolution, doesn't it, in the molecules to man sense, but it's not. It's the opposite. I'll show you why. There's a particular bacterium called H. pylori. And H. pylori can cause stomach ulcers, and the way doctors treat it, they give you an antibiotic. Now, the antibiotic is a chemical substance. This chemical substance is absorbed through the cell wall of the bacterium. Now, in the bacterium, part of their DNA codes for an enzyme. The enzyme actually breaks down the antibiotic into poisons. Now, the enzyme is used in the biochemistry of the cell for its normal function. When that enzyme comes in contact with the antibiotic, it breaks up into poisons that then attack the DNA and destroy it and kill the bacterium. That's how it works. Now, sometimes what can happen is there's a mutation. The mutation occurs in the DNA where the code for the enzyme is disrupted for whatever reason. And therefore, now it can't make the enzyme because the piece of code there for the enzyme has been in some way destroyed, or it's been corrupted in some way, and because it's corrupted, it can no longer be read to make that enzyme. What happens? Well, the enzyme no longer attacks the antibiotic, no longer breaks it into poisons, so now there are no poisons to destroy the DNA, so it doesn't kill it. So it's now become resistant. You know why it became resistant? It lost the ability to do something it once could do. Its code became corrupted and it no longer can produce an enzyme. And so then the offspring of that bacteria, by and large, inherit that mutant gene, and so they're all resistant as well. And we produce what are called in hospitals our superbugs. You ever heard of those superbugs? They're not really superbugs, by the way. We call them super wimps, and I'll tell you why. A friend of mine had an accident in Australia, a car accident. He ended up in hospital. He was a doctor himself. And in his ward, all the people that were there, unfortunately, contracted one of those superbugs as an infection, one of those infections with the superbugs. And they died one by one, except this one person. He didn't die. And the specialist doctors there said to him, when you come out of hospital, you need to roll in the dirt. They actually said, you know, get out, roll in the dirt. And the reason, what they're really saying is this. See, in the hospital, we're using the antibiotics and you're creating a sterile environment. All those bacteria that don't have the mutant gene, they're all killed off. It's only the mutant ones that survive. That's why they're called superbugs. But when you get out of that environment and you get out in the normal environment, the mutant ones are the weaker ones, and they will die off, and eventually the original ones will come back. And that helps us understand what's really going on here. So, you know, those super bugs, so to speak, can be very, very dangerous. That's true, but they're actually weaker than the original. So there's an example to show you how you can gain a resistance because you lost something. See, in the molecules to man sense of evolution is true, you want to gain information, not gain a resistance. You see the difference? You've got to gain information, and that's not what's happening here. Now, just a couple of other things. When it comes to looking at Noah's Ark, people say to me, Noah's Ark, that couldn't be true. Noah couldn't have fitted all the animals on board. But if you start to understand what we're talking about here, you start to realize, did he need the number of animals that we really think he needed on board the Ark? Right? Now, it was all the land animals he had to take on board, not the sea creatures, but the land creatures. Well, think about it. Did he need all the different varieties, species of dogs? The answer is no, he only needed what? 2 dogs. What about elephants? Did he need the stegomastodons, the mastodons, the African elephants, the Indian elephants, the mammoths? He didn't need all those, did he? In fact, you know, in Nepal today, in the country of Nepal, the king owns some property with a herd of elephants, and some of the elephants that he has there have the high dome and sloping back characteristic of the mammoths, which means some of the mammoth genes are still in the elephant population, which means they're all closely related, which means they're all the one what? Kind. They're all the one kind, so you only need 2 elephants. When it comes to cats, we're not sure how many cat kinds there were. There might possibly only be 1 cat kind, or maybe 2, or maybe 3. You know, as you do your calculations, Noah probably only needed 16,000 individual animals or so representative of the various kinds. He didn't need millions of species or anything like that. It makes a big difference when you understand this, and that means you're enabled to defend your faith again. You can give answers out there. When somebody says, do you know Noah's Ark? No way you could fit all those animals on board. How many animals did he need? What size was the ark? Let's talk about this. Let's talk about natural selection. Let's talk about speciation. You know, that's not evolution. Look at all, and when you explain that, you say, see, we've got answers. Next question, please. What a difference it makes when you can do that. Then I have some people who say to me, wait a minute. When you look in Alaska or in Siberia, you see millions of mammoth bones. And these are in the surface sediments, and presumably these were post-flood in the sense of the animals that lived there and died. When was Noah's flood? About 4,500 years ago. Are you saying that well within that 4,500 years that enough elephants were able to migrate from Noah's Ark and form different species and so on and get up to Siberia and Alaska and produce millions of elephants that died and were fossilized there and so on? Yeah, in fact, it happened in much less than 4,500 years. Oh, wait a minute, it would take many years to get millions of elephants. No, here's a sign from the Natural History Museum in London. During their lifetime, a pair of elephants could give rise to 60 descendants, more than enough to replace the original pair. At this rate, their family could swell to 19 million living members after 700 years. You see, population growth is exponential, isn't it? In fact, when you start with 8 people at the time of Noah's flood, just 4,500 years ago, and if you work on the normal population growth rates and so on, you'll find you can get the billions of people in the world today very, very easily from 8 people just 4,500 years ago. And so within hundreds of years after the flood, you could have millions of all sorts of animals migrating all over the earth. Not only that, some people say to me, but wait a minute, we don't tend to see lots of different species forming today. No, you think about this. The time of Noah's Ark, you take on there the dog kind, with the information probably very representative of the original dog kind. When the dogs come off Noah's Ark and split off after the flood, and because of all the different environments after the flood and then becoming isolated in particular places where, you know, the ending of the Ice Age isolates them from other countries and so on, other land masses, what's going to happen? You're going to dilute the gene pool. You would expect perhaps rapid speciation further back to the flood, but not so much today. Now, we do see some natural selection today. We do see some different species forming today. In the London Underground, since the last war, there's a different species of mosquito that has formed there. But there's still a mosquito, by the way. You understand that, don't you? Now, the interesting thing, though, is that even in the present world, evolutionists have made some comments about natural selection. They're very interesting. Here we have, as reported in US News and World Report, a study in the latest Science, which is the journal Science, evolutionist journal Science, shows natural selection can reshape organisms faster than some might have predicted. And then in talking about fruit flies, they say the change is as fast as they've ever seen. I think this will shake up a lot of people. Talking about stickleback fish shows that natural selection can yield new species, okay? And then talking about pinyon pines, these examples say that natural selection can cause a population to change very quickly and hint that speciation could occur very quickly. And there's a collection of quotes there from some different sources where evolutionists are admitting, even we've been surprised at how fast natural selection can actually occur. And so could you get all these different species within 4,500 years that we see today after the flood, the different dogs, the different elephants? The answer is yes. There are probably other genetic mechanisms we're not even aware of, and they're just starting to find out about some of those. And so what I'm saying to you is, hey, observational science, when you apply it to the dog kind, what we see happening in genetics, involved in natural selection, involved in adaptation, speciation, actually confirms what the Bible teaches. God made distinct kinds of animals and plants to reproduce after their own kind, does not confirm evolutionary changes necessary for molecules to man for increasing pools of information. There is no mechanism for that at all. And so what are we saying? The Bible's true. The Bible's history is true. Isn't it exciting being a Christian? It really is. Don't you get excited the more we study all this? Sure, because the Bible's true. Now, I have people say to me, okay, but if what you're saying is right, I mean, it's so obvious, why don't the majority of people believe it? Well, good question. You know what the Bible says? The heart of man is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. You can't ignore the spiritual state of man. The Bible makes it very clear that man is in rebellion against God, that man does not want to believe God's word. In fact, in the book of Peter, 2 Peter, concerning scoffers who absolutely ridicule people who believe in the flood and believe in creation, 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 5, we read this, "For this they willingly are ignorant of," or some translations actually say deliberately forget. In other words, it has nothing to do with the evidence. They just don't want to believe. Think about this for a moment. Do you realize NASA scientists once proposed the possibility of a global flood on Mars when there wasn't any liquid water on Mars? And yet they won't propose a global flood on Earth when it's mostly covered by water. Now, why are they happy to have a global flood possibility on a planet that has no liquid water and mock at the idea of a global flood on a planet that's mostly covered by water? You know why? I'll tell you why. Because if the Bible spoke about a global flood on Mars, they would scoff at that idea and say there never was a global flood on Mars. Because if there's a global flood on Earth, it means the Bible's true. It means there really was a flood in Noah's day. But it means that God is judge. It means that God created. It means that man is a sinner. It means that man needs to acknowledge Jesus Christ as his Lord and Saviour. I wanted to finish by just giving you a quote from a present-day scientist, Richard Lewontin from Harvard University, just to show you that scientists are biased. There's no such person as a neutral scientist, right? All have beliefs that determine how they interpret the evidence. Often in the public schools, what I find is students are taught that scientists start with the evidence to develop their theories. They're taught the wrong way. That is not true. Evidence doesn't speak for itself. You have to explain evidence. You have to interpret evidence. Scientists don't just start with evidence. They start with beliefs they already have to interpret the evidence. Think about this. In the public education system in America, the Bible is thrown out of the science classes. So when they look at evidence, are they looking at it in a neutral way? No, they've already decided the Bible has nothing to do with it. So they already have a belief system to start with. And let me give you a practical example here from Richard Lewontin, a Harvard geneticist from Harvard University. He said this: "Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism," which means matter is all there is. Then he says, "It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." You know what he's saying there? There's nothing in science that says you can't believe in the supernatural. Nothing. He says, on the contrary, we have a commitment to materialism. We're saying that man determines truth. Remember, that's how we really started this series. There's really two ways of looking at the evidence. Either God's word is truth or man determines truth. And when you start with man determines truth, he admits there's nothing in science that says that's correct. There's nothing in science that says in the beginning God is wrong. In fact, the more you look at observable science, it confirms in the beginning God. It confirms God created distinct kinds of animals and plants to reproduce after their own kind. It confirms we're all descendants of one man and one woman. It confirms there was a global flood. It confirms there was an event called the Tower of Babel. And if all that is true, it also confirms that Jesus Christ stepped into history to be a descendant of Adam, to die on a cross, be raised from the dead, and to pay the penalty for our sin so that all who put their faith and trust in him will know they can spend eternity with him. Isn't it exciting being a Christian? Isn't it exciting knowing you can trust God's word, and you can trust the history in the Bible, and you can go out there and defend your faith, and you can give a logical, reasoned defense, and that Christianity is not a blind faith? The Bible connects to reality. It connects to dirt, it connects to fossils, to the Grand Canyon, connects to people, connects to animals, connects to you and me, it connects to death, to suffering. The Bible connects to every aspect of reality. The Bible explains the world, where it came from, why it's here, who you are, what life is all about, and most of all, what you need to do so that you can spend eternity with the Lord Jesus Christ. And there we have it.